Researchers who take Bigfoot seriously don't take every alleged Bigfoot video seriously. In fact, they're often the first to call foul on the fakers. So when they tell us they've seen video they think is legit, we take a look too. August 20th, 1992, Blue Mountains, Oregon. Paul Freeman, an experienced former U.S. Forest Service patrolman, has been frequenting Duck Spring for a few weeks after seeing unusual footprints.
Yeah, it looks like they've been here. Looks like it's pretty fresh.
First, he discovers ample evidence of Bigfoot activity, including multiple tracks.
Yeah, look at there.
Next, he hears something forging its way through the woods. And finally, he sees this.
I hear the brush popping and stuff. Oh, there he goes.
So there's a lot here that Bigfoot hunters find fascinating. One thing is the gait, especially the big strides, right? Big strides, this space through here, and the low swinging arm movement. They say that's not human. Also the detail in the hair. They say it's too natural to be a costume. Paul's son Mike was in the basement the day his dad rushed home with the footage.
I kind of ran up the stairs, and here's my dad standing there, and he's covered in sweat and dirt, and he's pale in color, and he's shaking. I always tell people that that's the only time in my entire life that I ever saw my dad scared of anything.
Field researcher Cliff Barrickman, a close friend of the Freeman family, is impressed by the research that Paul conducted in the wake of his alleged Sasquatch encounter.
Paul had been collecting data on a series of maps for 10 years. Every time a sighting report came in, he would record the location and the date on a large map that was hanging in his basement. The evidence collected by Paul Freeman and his network of researchers in the Blue Mountains has been closely examined by more PhDs and anthropologists than any other data set in all Bigfoot history.
But for Barrickman, the Freeman footage speaks for itself, drawing compelling comparisons with the famous Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film of 1967.
There are a lot of similarities between the Patterson-Gimlin film and the Freeman footage. The subject does resemble the subject in the Patterson-Gimlin film. The head is a little bit lower, the shoulders are higher, which is a very ape-like characteristic. The arms are quite long and they swing quite slowly. I think it's a Bigfoot, but whatever that is, it is quite large and quite massive.
In Freeman's Bigfooting career from 1982 to 1997, he found and casted anywhere between 50 and 75 Bigfoot prints in the Blue Mountains, many of which have been examined and verified as genuine by scientists all over the country. To find out if his 1992 sighting is actually a real Bigfoot, we turn to our experts. First, we turn to wildlife biologist Floyd Hayes to rule out any possible animal misidentification.
A black bear can be large and black, and it can walk on its two hind legs, but this animal seems to be a fully functional quadruped walking routinely on its hind legs, and bears only walk short distances on their hind legs. This also seems to have a much flatter face than a bear, which has a much more pointed snout. So I don't think that is a bear. I cannot rule this out as being a Bigfoot.
Next, we turn to anatomist and anthropologist Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who gained renown early in his career for his work with Paul Freeman's prints.
As it walks across, one can't help but be struck by resemblances to the Patterson-Gimlin film. The massiveness of this figure is impressive. This smallish head set low down on the shoulders with massive musculature. Trapezius coming high up on the back of the head is quite apparent. The length of the arms is impressive. As it swings its arm back, the way the sunlight plays across the hair has a very natural appearance, unlike the scattering effect of faux fur. I mean, if this was a hoax, it would require, very skilled knowledge of animal anatomy.
It's not only the anatomy of the creature that works for Meldrum, it's the location.
It's actually ideal habitat. The evidence that has emerged from this region has been examined by more PhDs than from any other part of the country. The first evidence of skin ridge detail, which all primates have on the palms of their hands and soles of their feet, was evidenced in examples of footprints that come from this habitat. Southeastern Washington has extensive loess deposits. Loess is a very fine glacial sediment. As a result, that very fine textured soil picks up remarkable details in animal tracks. There's a very high likelihood that this is a genuine piece of video evidence of Sasquatch.
Our verdict? Possible Bigfoot. In our experts' opinions, this could indeed be a true Sasquatch encounter. And it's important to note there were 2 creatures allegedly seen, even though only one was caught on camera. That seems to indicate there could be more where they came from. So we're going to keep our ears to the ground for further evidence. It's March 2018 in Longyu, China, about 100 miles southwest of Shanghai. Researcher Andrew Kuznetsov is visiting the area to see what some call the 9th wonder of the ancient world. His footage reveals a gigantic cavern with huge pillars supporting a 60 to 100 foot high sloped ceiling. The walls are covered in a series of parallel chiseled lines and symbols, including stone carvings of animals.
As soon as I first saw these caves, I thought that they were made by modern machinery. I was overwhelmed because of the giant volume of extracted material. The main mystery of these caves is why they were built, because there is no signs of using them by humans.
Journalist Aaron McCarthy says the caves were only recently discovered in 1992 when 4 farmers were trying to drain what legend said was a bottomless lake gifted from the gods.
When they drained the first pond, they discovered a huge cavern. They ended up draining a bunch more ponds, and in all, they discovered 24 caverns. But the average size of the caverns is 11,000 square feet, which is 7 times bigger than the average American house.
Archaeologists believe these underground grottos were carved by hand more than 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty. And what's even more remarkable is that the walls and columns supporting the caves are relatively thin, yet they have remained intact for millennia despite seismic activity in the area. Still, though this is considered a wonder of the world, unlike the pyramids and the Colosseum, there's no universally accepted idea of what it was used for, which is rather bizarre.
Some have speculated that perhaps this is some kind of underground palace or a tomb for an emperor. The first emperor of China was buried with 8,000 terracotta soldiers. Another theory is that this was always meant to be a reservoir.
Whatever its purpose, the network of caves is so massive and detailed that it seems it would be nearly impossible to construct with only the hand tools available back in ancient China.
Experts have estimated that it would have taken 1,000 people working 24 hours a day for 6 years to carve out all of these caverns. Workers would have had to remove nearly 1 million cubic meters of rock.
Some questions that add to the mystery. If workers excavated all that rock, then where did it go? And why were no tools found in or near the caverns? There's also no mention of the caves in any written records, so no one even knew they existed until 30 years ago. Let's see what our experts can unearth. Archaeologist Dr. Ed Barnhart considers whether this cave system could be an ancient palace.
The palace has a number of different functions and individual rooms for privacy, the kind of individual spaces that a palace needs to function are not indicated in these caverns.
Then since they're so elaborate, could they have been burial chambers like with the emperor's terracotta warriors? Anthropologist Kathy Strain thinks it's unlikely.
They have to continually pump this because water keeps getting in it from natural sources. I would not assume that someone would want to bury somebody in a constructed cave that continually filled with water.
Others have wondered if the caves were used by miners to extract some valuable mineral, but no trace of mining equipment has ever been found. And since these spaces seem to fill naturally with water, Strain suggests they could have been originally created as reservoirs.
They were precisely built so that water coming down from rain or a monsoon would get captured into these caverns and then it'd be used by the local people for a water source. It's like a big gutter, and it's all focused to go into the caverns.
Yet Barnhart isn't so sure.
If these were reservoirs, why would they bother carving the walls in these nice linear formations?
Barnhart thinks there might be another explanation for why water was welcomed in this space.
The very few objects that we have found in these caverns are from the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was famous for its silk technology. The weaving of silk is best done in a very humid environment, with those parallel lines that are really kind of overhangs, each one of them, creating places where the condensation would rise the humidity within this environment.
For 6 weeks after they hatch, silkworms eat mulberry leaves and then start spinning their silk cocoons. Scientists have found around 75% humidity is ideal for silkworm growth. It helps keep the leaves from withering. Once the cocoons are ready, they are boiled to soften them into threads. The threads are dyed, spun, and woven into fabric, with humid air keeping the natural fibers more pliable. Our verdict? The true purpose behind these mysterious caves remains unknown. Barnhart's theory about them being used for silk making is intriguing, but there's no smoking gun. Archaeologists haven't found any artifacts like looms, silkworm cocoons, or minerals for dyes in or near the caves. It's May 2011 on the Chandelier Islands, 50 miles offshore from southeastern Louisiana. Architect and amateur archaeologist George Jelle has received permission to do exploration dives in the area with a remote-operated vehicle. What his underwater videos reveal is astonishing. Scattered on the seafloor are what appear to be large granite blocks. The cubic stones don't seem to be at all natural, since they all have 90-degree squared edges and some have carvings and cuts. Check out what they look like after he's brought them up and cleaned them off. Could they once have been part of a larger structure? George says he's certain this is the site of an ancient lost city that he has named Chrysentis.
I'm an architect and a contractor, so I do know what buildings look like, even if they're underwater and covered up somewhat with sand. And that's what we have here. An ancient culture that nobody knew was there.
George says the location of this submerged civilization first came to him while sleeping one night in the 1960s.
I had an incredibly vivid dream. I got up and I sketched it. And the dream was what I call the Star of David diagram. And it showed in that diagram that if you start off at Giza, at the Great Pyramid, there were 6 cities at the same latitude as Giza, and one of them was in Louisiana.
Journalist Aaron McCarthy says George believes the block seen in this video could be at least 12,000 years old, predating the Incan, Mayan, and Aztec civilizations.
Granite is not natural to the area. His theory is that they were brought from somewhere that's not Louisiana and floated down the Mississippi at some point before the last ice age, when this area of Louisiana would have been above water.
And wait, there's more. George believes that just as we see in Giza, there is a 280-foot tall pyramid here that is now buried in silt.
He claims that it produces a ton of electromagnetic activity, and fishermen who fish out near that area say that it actually affects their compasses.
George says this buildup of energy gives more credence to his pyramid theory.
I know that having done 50 years of research in how they produce energy, the only architectural form that I'm aware of that can do that is a pyramidal structure.
At least one Russian study has found a pyramid's chambers can collect and concentrate electromagnetic energy. It seems clear these huge blocks were placed here by someone or something. As glacial ice melted at the end of the Ice Age, it flowed down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, submerging the coastline and moving it 60 miles inland. So could these blocks have been deposited here by the river? Or could a lost Louisiana city, which George calls Chrysentis, have been the Ice Age's greatest casualty? Archaeologist Dr. Ed Barnhart says if this site is really 12,000 years old, it would be from around the time of the emergence of the Clovis culture, thought by some to be the first inhabitants of the Americas.
Clovis was not a culture that gathered in large groups of people or in sedentary ways. They were hunter-gatherers. They traveled, and that's how they survived.
So if it's unlikely the nomadic Clovis would build a permanent site like Crescentus, what about the humdrum explanation that this is just an artificial reef from more modern times, built as a habitat for marine life?
Typically, when we make reefs, we don't make them out of stone. We use things like tires and other lighter material that works just as well for creating natural reefs.
Physicist Matthew Shadagas weighs another theory. Could these granite blocks have been ballast dropped from European ships colonizing the area centuries ago?
At one point, ballast blocks were needed on ships to lower their center of mass in order to increase the stability of the ship. Then these rocks may get dumped.
The ballast stones were normally discarded in order to keep the weight the same as ships pulled into port to pick up new cargo.
However, calculations have been done that show you would need at least 3 dozen ships or more to have dumped their ballast, all in this one location. It just doesn't make any sense.
So what about the theory that the electromagnetic energy detected here is evidence of a lost pyramid? NASA geologist Bob Anderson investigates.
If you take a rock that has a magnetic field in it, and you take it out of place and drop it, it still has the magnetic field in it. That magnetic field is frozen in those crystals. So it would not surprise me that if somebody took a magnetometer down there and looked at these rocks, that they would have a very localized magnetic field from somewhere else where the magnetic field is strong.
Then could this actually be a lost city?
Sea level can change over time, and so I think it makes sense that you may have a city that's farther than where the coast currently ends.
Our verdict? These are possible city ruins. We know these rocks don't belong there, and we don't think it's an artificial reef. And as Professor Shadaga said, sea levels have risen in the Gulf dramatically over the millennia. But we also need to be cautious. More research needs to be done before we know for sure what we're looking at. It's March 2014 in the Siêng Quang Plain in Lao Highlands. Amateur archaeologist Alexander Karekis sets out to capture a mysterious site on film for one of the first times ever. His footage shows thousands of large stone jars scattered a few feet apart throughout the field. These huge hollow jars are different sizes and look almost like they grew out of the vegetation around them.
The fascinating thing is some of these jars are humongous. You ask yourself, how did they get here? How did the people transport them there? How were they built?
Writer Eric Grunhauser says these stone jars have baffled scientists and locals since French archaeologists first studied them in the 1930s.
These giant stone jars date back almost 3,000 years. They have these nearly perfectly round apertures at the top. They stand anywhere from 3 to 10 feet high. Some of them weigh as much as 14 tons.
There is no written history about the origin of these jars, but local legend points to an ancient king of the giants.
The story goes that Kunshung won a decisive battle, and to celebrate, he wanted to create a feast with this local Lao Lao rice wine. And so he created all of these giant cups for his giant army.
Others have speculated that these artifacts may have had a more practical use for travelers of the ancient world.
One theory is that these jars were placed along an ancient trade route and that they acted sort of as storage containers. So as travelers passed through the area, they could come here, leave the goods in one of these jars, and then another traveler could come pick them up, almost like an ancient drop box.
Yet another theory is that these weren't used for sustenance in life, but instead were part of a ritual of death.
The concept that these jars would have been used as burial urns is backed up by the findings of some archaeologists who, in a nearby cave, found some human remains and some ashes.
The simple fact that these jars have survived is an anomaly. They lie on the site of the secret war in Laos, where the U.S. government dropped more bombs on the country in the 1960s and 70s than they used in Germany and Japan combined during World War II. The area is off limits to most since the region is littered with mines and active bombs, making it too dangerous to study properly. But let's see what our experts can uncover. Archaeologist Dr. Ed Barnhart explores whether there's any credence to the legend of the Giant King.
Giants are in virtually every folklore around the planet. It might be something to do with finding dinosaur or mammoth bones. Mammoth skulls were the origin of cyclopses, but archaeology has yet to produce a single skeleton of a giant humanoid creature. So I can rule out that these jars are made by and for giants.
Then could these containers have been used as part of an ancient form of drop box, as Grundhauser suggested?
These jars are leading up towards northern India. And that would lead one towards the conclusion that they are part of a trade route. People had to have access to food and water. They may have also needed places to temporarily store the things that they were transporting in trade to secure them.
And Barnhart believes a recent discovery supports this theory.
In a region called Assam, they found another 65 of these jars. The more we find of these jars and see that there is a linear pattern they're following, the stronger the hypothesis that they represent a trade route between India and Southeast Asia.
Anthropologist Kathy Strain thinks these jars had another use that may have been tied to a death ritual.
I believe that these jars represent a burial practice that was very common in that area at the time. There is a cave nearby that has what is now a chimney drilled into it and black soot. We now realize that those were for cremations. Then they would remove the bones and then put them in a secondary burial and then put the ashes into one of the jars. And we know this because some of the jars that have been opened had human remains in them.
But scientists believe the human remains found in the jars were placed there long after the jars were created, so the containers might have been repurposed at some point. Our verdict? We like Barnhart's trade route storage theory. The discovery of those similar jars in India is pretty convincing. We know that ships have traveled back and forth between the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia since prehistoric times, carrying spices, aromatic roots, and resins. Still, the lack of written records and the fact that the dangerous landscape inhibits further study means we may never have a definitive answer.